Room 214 was supposed to smell like dry erase markers and cafeteria pizza drifting up through the vents. That Tuesday morning it smelled like ozone, sharp and metallic, the way the air smells right before lightning finds a place to land. Denny Ruiz noticed it first, and he wasn't even a student. He was the janitor, 71 years old, pushing a mop bucket down the science wing because someone had spilled orange juice outside the vending machine. He heard the hum before he saw anything. A low note, like a refrigerator, except it climbed instead of staying flat. It climbed until his back teeth ached. Then room 214 wasn't there. Not destroyed, not burned, not collapsed. The door was gone, the door frame was gone, and where 26 students and one teacher had been reciting the water cycle 4 seconds earlier, there was a wall. A clean, painted, cinder block wall, exactly like the wall on either side of it, exactly like it had been there since 1962 when the building went up. Denny stood there for 11 seconds with his mop dripping onto the tile, and then he started screaming, and he did not stop screaming until 2 teachers dragged him into the front office. By lunchtime there were 4 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, a bomb squad from the county, and a news helicopter circling so low the flag on the roof kept snapping sideways. By dinner time there was a name for it on every channel: the Roosevelt vanishing. 26 students, 1 teacher gone with no debris, no blood, no bodies, no sign that a room had ever existed where the hallway now ran 10 feet shorter than the blueprint said it should. Alina Reyes was 400 miles away, kneeling in a drainage culvert with a laser level, when her phone rang for the 9th time in 6 minutes. She was a structural monitoring engineer, the kind of person cities hired to tell them whether a bridge was about to fall down before it actually did. She almost didn't answer. Then she saw it was her sister, and something about seeing Camilla's name made her stomach drop before she even knew why. "Mateo's class," Camilla said, and her voice was already gone, already broken into pieces. "Elena, Mateo's whole class." Alina didn't remember the drive. She remembered gravel under her boots at 11 that night, red and blue lights bouncing off a school building that looked, from the outside, exactly the way it had looked in every photo Mateo had ever sent her of his robotics club. She remembered a state trooper telling her the site was closed to family. She remembered not caring. She got close enough to see the wall before anyone stopped her, and the wall was wrong in a way she couldn't explain to the trooper who grabbed her arm. Not wrong like broken, wrong like new. The paint was the same color, but it hadn't weathered the way 20 feet of hallway wall on either side of it had weathered. It looked like a photograph of a wall, dropped into a hole where a photograph didn't belong. "That's not the same wall," she said. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." "That's not the same wall," she said again, louder, and nobody listened, because grief makes people say strange things, and everyone assumed that was all this was. Inside, and there was an inside, though nobody outside believed that yet, Mrs. Adiz Akaffer was doing the only thing she knew how to do with 26 terrified 14-year-olds. She was taking attendance. "Priya Anand." Hear a whisper. "Kavi Anand." Nothing. She looked up from her clipboard, which she had somehow not dropped, though her hands were shaking badly enough that the pen kept skipping off the paper. Kavi wasn't at his desk. Kavi was crouched under it, both arms wrapped around a shoebox-sized wooden crate he'd smuggled into school that morning, and his face had gone the color of chalk. The room they were sitting in was room 214. Same desks, same periodic table poster peeling at one corner, same crack in the ceiling tile shaped like Florida. But the windows showed no parking lot. They showed a kind of gray that moved, slow, like fog rolling over fog, with no sun in it and no sky behind it, just distance that didn't seem to end and didn't seem to want to. "Everybody stay in your seats," Mrs. Akaffer said, and her voice cracked on the word seats, and every kid in that room heard the crack and understood, in the particular clear-eyed way that 14-year-olds understand things adults hope they don't, that their teacher was as frightened as they were. Dorian Castle, who played linebacker and had never once raised his hand in science class, stood up anyway. "What is that?" he said, pointing at the window, and nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer that wouldn't make things worse. By the second hour, the fear had curdled into something quieter and worse. The ordinary, humiliating problems of 27 bodies trapped together with no plan for how long they'd be trapped. Someone needed the bathroom down the hall that no longer existed. Someone's asthma inhaler was in a backpack in a locker 2 doors down, also gone. A girl named B started crying not because of the fog outside the window, but because she'd left her retainer case at home that morning and had shoved the retainer itself loose in her jacket pocket. And somehow, absurdly, that was the detail that broke her. It was Mrs. Ackefer who found the first small victory, and it was almost embarrassingly ordinary. The supply closet at the back of the room, meant for beakers and posters, turned out to hold a case of bottled water left over from a fire drill the year before, 4 boxes of granola bars donated for a canceled bake sale, and Dorian discovered this, digging through a bin nobody had opened in years. A first aid kit with enough supplies to handle B's asthma-adjacent panic, and the 2 scraped elbows that had happened when the lights first flickered. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't even hope, not yet. But it was proof that the room still had a few ordinary kindnesses left in it, and 27 frightened people needed that proof more than they needed an explanation. "We rationed the water," Mrs. Ackefer said, kneeling by the closet with the calm, decisive voice she usually reserved for lab safety lectures. "Nobody touches the granola bars without asking me first, and nobody goes near that window glass. We don't know what it is yet. We treat it like it's dangerous until we know otherwise." "What if it's not dangerous?" Priya said. "What if it's a way out?" "Then we'll find that out carefully," Mrs. Ackefer said, "instead of finding it out by losing someone." Back outside, in the first gray hour of morning, the wall was still a wall. Cadavered dogs had refused to go within 6 feet of it, sitting down hard on the tile and whining, refusing every command their handlers gave. A structural team from the state had run sonar through the cinder block and gotten back a reading that made 3 separate engineers ask to run it again, because the first time the wall had returned no measurable depth at all. Not solid, not hollow, nothing. As if the sonar pulse had gone out and simply never come back to tell them what it found. She was not the only family member standing at that fence that night. A woman named Grace Kessler stood a few feet away, clutching a photograph of her daughter Priya against her chest like it could keep the girl warm wherever she was, and when Alina introduced herself, Grace grabbed her wrist with a grip that left marks. "They keep saying gas main," Grace said. "My husband installed half the wiring in that building 11 years ago. There's no gas line anywhere near that wing. I told the man in the gray coat that twice, and he wrote it down and didn't say anything back." The man in the gray coat turned out to be Bratton, though Alina wouldn't learn his name for another few hours. She filed the detail away with the others. No gas line, no debris, a wall that looked photographed instead of built, small, stubborn facts that refused to fit the story they were being handed. The way a single loose thread refuses to lie flat no matter how many times you smooth the fabric over it. Alina heard about the sonar reading from a reporter who mistook her, in the chaos, for a parent liaison. She made him repeat it twice. "That's not possible," the reporter said, half to himself, writing it down anyway. "Sonar doesn't just disappear." "No," Alina said, "it doesn't." She had spent 11 years learning what solid things do under stress, how concrete cracks, how steel fatigues, how a beam groans for months before it finally gives. She had never in those 11 years learned what to do with a wall that ate sound. By the second day, the county had brought in a man named Agent Nils Bratton, who did not say which federal agency he worked for, only that his agency had jurisdiction now, and that the site would be sealed pending investigation. He was polite. He shook hands. He had the calm, flattened voice of a man who had given this exact speech in other towns, about other holes in the world. And Alina hated him within the first 30 seconds of meeting him, before he'd said anything hateful at all, simply because he looked at the wall the way you'd look at a broken vending machine. An inconvenience to be managed, not a mystery to be solved. "We believe," Bratton told the assembled families in the school gymnasium, standing in front of a folded American flag someone had set up on an easel for reasons nobody quite understood, "that we are dealing with a rare but documented structural collapse phenomenon, possibly related to a gas main failure, which resulted in a rapid and complete combustion event. We do not expect," he paused, chose the gentlest words he had, and they were still not gentle, "we do not expect to recover survivors." Camilla made a sound Alina had never heard a human being make before. Alina held her sister up by the shoulders because Illa's legs had simply stopped working, and over the top of Camilla's head, Alina looked at Bratton and said, "There's no debris. There's no smoke damage. There's no smell of gas. If there was a combustion event, where did the room go?" Bratton's eyes flicked to her, assessing, filing her away as a problem for later. "Ma'am, grief makes people look for explanations that feel less random than the truth. I understand that." "I'm not looking for an explanation that feels better," Alina said. "I'm looking for the one that's true, and gas mains don't leave walls that eat sonar." She saw something in his face then, just for a second, not surprise, but recognition, the look of a man realizing that someone in the room had noticed a detail his prepared statement hadn't accounted for. It was gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by the flat, careful mask again, but Alina had seen it, and she filed it away too. Inside the room, 31 hours had passed, though nobody inside had any clock that worked. Phones had no signal and no battery drain, frozen at 9:14 in the morning forever, which was its own particular horror, time refusing to move on a screen while their bodies kept getting hungrier and more tired and more afraid. Cavi had finally opened the crate. Priya, his older sister by 11 months and his least favorite person on most days, had cornered him against the supply closet. "That's your science fair thing," she said. "The stupid light box." "It's not stupid." "Cavi, what did you do?" He hadn't meant to bring it to school fully wired. He'd meant to bring the finished casing and build the circuit at lunch in the robotics room, where Mr. Hale let kids solder things unsupervised because Mr. Hale believed, correctly, that kids learned more from small burns than from lectures. But he'd stayed up too late the night before, obsessive the way he got, and by 2 in the morning the whole thing had been wired and humming on his desk. A resonance chamber built around a sliver of mineral his father, a geologist, had brought home from a survey site in Nevada, a rock that did something strange to radio equipment that nobody in his father's company had ever properly explained. Cavi's project was supposed to turn sound into visible light, frequency into color, a science fair trick, pretty and harmless. It had been sitting in the crate, powered on when the room folded. "I don't know what happened," he said, and it was the most honest sentence he'd said all day. "I didn't do this on purpose. I don't even know if I did this at all." "The lights flickered right when your box started humming," Priya said. "The same second, Cavi." "I know. So did you do this?" He looked at the crate, at the little coil of copper wire glowing a faint, sick green inside it, still running, still humming that same low note that had made Denny Ruiz's teeth ache in another world, 400 miles and one universe away. "I think I might have," Cavi said. "I don't know how to undo it if I did." That admission moved through the room like weather. Dorian, who 2 hours earlier had wanted to punch something, now wanted to punch Cavi specifically, and it took Mrs. Acaffer stepping physically between them, one hand flat on each boy's chest, to keep it from becoming something worse. "Nobody is punching anybody," she said. "We don't know that his project did this. We don't know that it didn't. What we know is that we have 26 students, one teacher, 4 bottles of water, and a box of granola bars from the supply closet, and none of that changes whether we fight each other or whether we figure this out. It was the sentence, more than any other, that kept the room from tearing itself apart in the first 2 days. Mrs. Ockafer didn't know it yet, but that sentence was the exact shape of the thing her students would need to survive. Not comfort, not false hope, just a reason to keep functioning as a group instead of 27 separate terrors. Outside, Alina had stopped sleeping in any meaningful sense. She'd rented a room at the Cedar Hollow Motor Lodge 6 minutes from the school and turned it into something that looked, by day 3, like the wall of a conspiracy thriller, except everything pinned to it was real, sourced, and checked twice. She'd gotten the sonar data from the reporter's contact, off the record. She'd gotten weather service records for the morning of the vanishing, because something about the timing nagged at her. 9:14 a.m., a Tuesday. Nothing special about the date on a calendar, but she checked anyway, out of the habit of a person who never assumed anything was a coincidence until she tested it. What she found made her sit down slowly on the edge of the motel bed. A geomagnetic storm, moderate but unusual for the season, had struck that morning. Nothing that would make national news, auroras a little further south than normal, a few satellite hiccups, nothing more. But it had peaked, according to the monitoring station 2 counties over, at 9:13 a.m. 1 minute before room 214 disappeared. She called Camilla. "Do you know if Mateo's class was doing anything unusual that morning? Any equipment, any experiments, anything electrical?" "Alina, they're saying there's no survivors. I can't." "Camilla, please, anything electrical." A long silence and then small. "There's a science fair coming up. Mateo said some kid in his class had been talking about a project all week, something with lights and sound. He said it was cool. He wanted to build one too." Alina wrote down light and sound on the motel notepad, next to geomagnetic storm, 9:13 a.m., and stared at the 2 lines until they blurred. She found Sheriff Dale Whitfield the next morning. Not because she was looking for him, but because he found her, parked outside the sealed school gates in his truck with 2 coffees, one of which he handed through her window without asking if she wanted it. "You're the aunt," he said, "the engineer. News travels. Small town." He looked at the wall past the fence for a while before he spoke again. "I've policed this town for 26 years. I know what a gas explosion looks like. I've seen 2. This isn't that, and Bratton knows it isn't that, and I don't like being told to sign paperwork that says it is." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person who's asked me a real question since he got here, instead of asking me to feel sorry for you. And because my niece is in that classroom too, and I am done being handed a story that doesn't fit the evidence." He drank his coffee. "What do you need?" What Alina needed, it turned out, was access to the sonar logs, to the original blueprints, to whatever readings the federal team was taking behind that fence that they weren't sharing with families. Whitfield couldn't get her all of it. He got her enough. Inside, day 3 felt different from day 1 and 2, in the way that all long ordeals eventually change shape. The fear hadn't gone away. It had just stopped being loud enough to fill every second, because bodies cannot sustain panic indefinitely, and eventually even terrified 14-year-olds get bored, and boredom, strangely, turned out to be useful. Bored kids started noticing things. It was Priya who noticed the pattern first, mostly by accident. She'd been staring at the window, the slow gray fog beyond it, for so long that she'd started counting her own breaths just to have something to do, and somewhere around the 1100 breaths, she realized the fog wasn't uniform. It thinned, rhythmically, like a tide, except the tide came in roughly every 33 hours instead of every 12. "Cavi," she grabbed his sleeve. "Watch the window, just watch it." He watched. 20 minutes later, the gray outside thinned to something almost transparent, and for 4 or 5 seconds, impossibly, they could see Not the parking lot, not anything from their old world, but something. Structure. Shapes. Like looking through frosted glass at a room on the other side, except the room on the other side had geometry that didn't sit right in the eye, angles that seemed to fold back on themselves the longer you looked. Then the fog rolled back in, and it was gone. "That's the second time I've seen that happen," Cavi said, and his voice had changed. The guilt was still there. It would be there for a long time, but underneath it, something else was waking up, something that sounded almost like his old self, the version of him that got excited about frequency graphs at 2 in the morning. "The first time was right when we got here. If it happens on a cycle, we can predict it. If we can predict it, maybe we can use it." "Use it for what?" Dorian said. "I don't know yet." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got," Cavi said, "and it's better than sitting here waiting to starve." They tried something during the very next thinning, before they understood anything about timing or resonance, or what the box was actually capable of. Cavi simply carried it to the window and held it up, hoping proximity alone might be enough. And for one heart-stopping moment it seemed to work. The fog didn't just thin. It seemed to bend toward the box, curling like smoke around a draft, and 3 separate students said later that they were certain they'd heard a voice, distant and warped, calling a name that might have been Mateo's. Then the window went solid gray again, faster than any previous cycle, almost as if it had recoiled. The box's green light dimmed to almost nothing. Mateo, white-faced, insisted for the rest of the day that he'd heard his aunt's voice, specifically, and nobody had the heart to tell him that was almost certainly wishful thinking, because by then everyone in that room had started hearing what they needed to hear in the sound the fog made when it moved. "We can't just react to it," Cavi said afterward, more to High himself than to anyone else, turning the dimmed box over in his hands like it had betrayed him. "Reacting almost broke it. We have to understand the pattern before we use it again, or we might not get a next time at all." That failure cost them nearly 6 hours of the device's fading power, and it cost the room something harder to measure, the first real taste of what hope could do to you if you spent it carelessly. Mrs. Acaffer watched her students go quiet and heavy in a new way after that, and understood that despair, for a little while, was actually more dangerous than the fog itself. Mrs. Acaffer, who had been silently rationing granola bars into eighths, so that 27 people could stretch 4 days of food into what she privately feared might need to become 2 weeks, made a decision then. She let the kids start experimenting with the box, on the condition that Cavi explain, out loud, every single thing he did before he did it, so that if something went wrong, at least someone else understood what had happened. It was, in its own strange way, the best class Mrs. Acaffer ever taught. 26 kids who had spent 3 years mostly ignoring science period now leaned over a desk in a room that shouldn't exist, watching a boy they'd mocked 2 days earlier try to explain resonance frequency like their lives depended on it, because they did. Outside, the story had started to rot the way stories do when a government agency tries too hard to control them. Bratton had given 3 more press conferences, each one slightly more polished and slightly less convincing than the last, and slowly, reporters had started asking why federal agents were treating a gas explosion, his word, with the operational secrecy usually reserved for something else entirely. A cable news panel debated it for 40 minutes one night without reaching a conclusion, which Alina watched from her motel bed with her jaw clenched so tight it ached the next morning. She'd started calling contacts from her old graduate program, a physicist in Colorado who studied electromagnetic anomalies, a seismologist who'd once explained resonance cascades to her over a beer at a conference she barely remembered attending. She sent them everything: the sonar readings, the geomagnetic data, the second-hand detail about a student science project involving light and sound. Most of them were kind and useless. One of them was neither. Dr. Priyanka Basu called her back at 1 in the morning, and she did not sound kind at all. She sounded awake in the particular way scientists get awake when something has just made sense to them for the first time. Send me the mineral sample data again, the one from the geologist father. I don't have a sample. I have a second-hand description from a 14-year-old boy's family. Then get me a description of the rock, color, weight, where it was surveyed. Elena called Camilla, who called Cavi's mother, who, remarkably, given everything, remembered enough about her husband's work trip to relay a rough description. Dense, dark, faintly warm to the touch even in a cold room, pulled from a deposit near a defunct military testing site in Nevada that had been quietly decommissioned in the 90s. Basu went quiet on the phone for almost a full minute after Elena read that back to her. That's not a natural mineral, Basu finally said. Or if it is, it's one that's been altered. Testing sites like that sometimes leave behind material that's been exposed to fields nobody fully understands, because nobody fully understood them at the time either. If a kid built a resonance chamber around something like that and ran it during a geomagnetic peak, in a building with old copper wiring acting as an unintentional antenna array, what would happen? I genuinely don't know, Basu said, but I know it wouldn't be nothing. And Elena, if it's cyclical, like you said the sonar behavior suggests, that's actually good news. Cyclical means there's a structure to it. Structure means it might be reversible. Randomness would be the thing to fear. This isn't random. For the first time in 4 days, Elena let herself cry, not out of despair, but because for 4 days she had been the only person who believed her nephew might still be alive. And now, finally, someone with letters after her name had said a sentence that made that belief sound like science instead of denial. She brought the theory to Bratton the next morning, uninvited, walking straight past the checkpoint with a folder under her arm, and enough momentum that the young agent guarding the gate hesitated half a second too long before deciding to physically stop her. Bratton met her in a trailer that smelled like instant coffee and printer toner. I know you're not going to tell me what your agency actually thinks this is, she said before he could speak. I know you have data you're not sharing. I'm not asking you to share it. I'm telling you what I think it is, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong. Because if I'm right, sealing that site permanently is the same as killing 27 people who might currently be alive. Bratton studied her for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted, not warmth, but a kind of tired recalibration, the look of a man deciding whether the script he'd been handed was worth defending anymore. There have been other sites, he said finally, quiet enough that she had to lean in. 4 that I know of over 11 years. Smaller. No people involved, thank God, until now. They all resolved on their own within a window of time. The longest was 60 hours. This is already past that. Elena's stomach dropped. Past it by how much? 9 hours. So what's your protocol when a site goes past the window? Bratton didn't answer right away, and the silence told her everything the man wasn't allowed to say out loud. You seal it, she said. Permanently. That's the protocol. Concrete and steel over whatever's left, and you write a report that calls it a gas explosion, and in 20 years nobody remembers there were people who might have still been in there. That's not, he stopped, started again more carefully. That is a worst-case protocol, reserved for sites that show no further anomalous activity. If there's still activity, the protocol doesn't apply yet. Is there still activity? He looked at her for a long moment, and Elena understood that this was the moment where a man who followed rules for a living either kept following them or didn't. There was a fluctuation 2 nights ago, he said, 33-hour interval near as we can tell. Sonar picks up something for 4 to 6 seconds each cycle. We logged it as inconclusive. A pause. The permanent seal order comes down from Washington at 600 tomorrow regardless. That decision's already made. It was made before you walked in here. Then we have 1 cycle left, Elena said. Maybe 2 if we're lucky and the numbers hold. Bratton repeated, and something almost like a wry, exhausted smile crossed his face, gone in an instant. "There is no we, Ms. Reyes. I have orders." "You have a family somewhere, too," Alina said. "I know you do. You've got a ring line on your finger that's paler than the rest. You took it off before you got here so grieving parents wouldn't have to look at proof you get to go home to someone. So don't tell me about orders like you don't know what's on the other side of that wall." He didn't answer that, but he also didn't call the two agents standing outside the trailer to escort her off the site, and Alina decided, driving back to the motel with her hands shaking on the wheel, that this was the closest thing to permission she was going to get. Inside, the fourth day had become the strangest one yet. Cavi's device battered, its casing cracked from being handled by a dozen anxious hands, its green glow flickering weaker now that its battery, however it worked in a place where nothing else drained power, seemed finally to be running low, had become the center of gravity for the entire room. He'd mapped 3 cycles now. 33 hours, give or take 20 minutes, matching almost exactly what Priya had first guessed by counting her own breathing. "If the fog thins because our world and wherever this is are lining up," Cavi said, standing at the front of the room the way Mrs. Acaffer usually stood, chalk in hand, though there was nothing left to write on the board that mattered. "Then during that window, this room is closer to being back where it started than it is the rest of the time. What if we boost the resonance right when the window opens? Push it, instead of just watching it happen to us." "Push it with what?" Dorian said. "The dying flashlight box." "With the dying flashlight box and every phone charger cable in this room, and the copper wire in the light fixtures, if we can get the ceiling panel off," Cavi said. "I need more antenna length. That's the piece I've been missing. The rock does something to the signal, but it needs more wire to actually push a field big enough to matter." It took the class 2 hours to strip 4 ceiling light fixtures using nothing but a stapler, a broken ruler, and Dorian's considerable upper body strength applied to a stuck ceiling tile. Nobody complained about the work. For the first time since the vanishing, 27 frightened people had something to do with their hands that wasn't waiting. Mrs. Acaffer watched her students loop bare copper wire around a boy's cracked wooden crate with the focused, silent intensity of a surgical team, and thought, with an ache she would carry for the rest of her life whether or not any of them made it home, that she had never in 19 years of teaching seen a room full of children work together like this. Whatever came next, she thought, they had already found something in each other worth surviving for. At 5:58 the next morning, Lena parked her car outside the fence with her lights off, 200 yards from the checkpoint, and watched dawn come up gray and ordinary over a school building that held the worst and strangest thing that had ever happened in this county. Sheriff Whitfield's truck idled beside hers. He'd brought his own set of bolt cutters, unasked, and set them on the seat between them like a question neither of them wanted to say out loud yet. "They'll arrest you," he said. "Probably." "They'll arrest me too." "Probably." He looked at the fence, then at his watch. "Cycle's supposed to hit somewhere around 6:15 by your numbers. If Basu's math is right. And if it's not." Alina didn't answer that. She was watching Bratton's black SUV pull up to the checkpoint, watching him get out and stand there with his hands in his coat pockets, not moving toward the building, not moving away from it either, just standing at the edge of a decision, the way she had stood at the edge of one for 4 days now. At 6:02, a convoy of 2 more vehicles arrived, the SEAL team, concrete trucks idling further back on the access road, engineers in hard hats carrying equipment that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with ending this permanently, cleanly, quietly. "They're early," Alina said. "They're following orders," Whitfield said. "Orders don't wait for anybody's math." One of the engineers began unspooling thick black cable from the back of a truck, running it toward a portable mixer already grinding to life somewhere down the access road. And the sound of it, mechanical, patient, utterly indifferent to whether anyone was still alive on the other side of that wall, was worse to Alina than any siren could have been. Sirens meant someone was still trying to save something. That grinding, chugging engine meant someone had already decided there was nothing left worth saving and was simply cleaning up the paperwork. She checked her watch. 6:06. If Basu's numbers were right, they had 9 minutes, maybe less, before the window opened, and maybe 40 seconds once it did before it closed again for good, sealed this time not by whatever impossible physics had made the fold in the first place, but by several tons of ordinary concrete poured by people who believed with complete sincerity that they were doing the responsible thing. Elena got out of the car. What happened over the next 11 minutes would later be described in Agent Bratton's official incident report, heavily redacted before it reached anyone outside a small circle of clearances, as a civilian security breach coinciding with anomalous activity, a sentence that did no justice whatsoever to what it felt like to live through. Elena went over the fence with Whitfield's bolt cutters before anyone could stop her, sprinting across frost-hardened grass toward a wall that 4 days of research had convinced her was not a wall at all but a held breath, a door mid-swing, a thing waiting to be finished. Behind her she heard shouting, heard Bratton's voice snap out an order, and then, a half-second later, heard him countermand it, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like relief at being given, finally, a reason to disobey the orders he hated. Inside at 6:11 by no clock that existed anywhere, 27 people stood in a circle around a cracked wooden box strung with looping copper wire, holding hands not because anyone told them to, but because it seemed, in that moment, like the only thing left to do that made any sense. "Now," Cavi said, and his sister squeezed his hand once hard, and he threw the last switch. The green light inside the box didn't flicker this time. It roared bright, sudden, filling the room with a color that had no name, and the low hum that had haunted this space for 4 days climbed and climbed until it wasn't a sound anymore. It was a pressure, a weight against every eardrum in the room, and the gray fog beyond the windows didn't just thin this time. It tore. Outside, Elena reached the wall at the exact moment it stopped being a wall. There is no good way to describe what a room looks like when it decides, all at once, to exist again in the place it left. Elena would spend years afterward trying to explain it to people who hadn't seen it, and always failing. The closest she ever came was this. It was like watching a photograph develop in reverse and forward at the same time, color and shape arriving from every direction at once instead of one. The cinderblock wall folding open like something that had never really been solid, revealing not rubble, not the past 4 days of horror written on the room in obvious damage, but 26 students and 1 teacher standing in a circle, blinking against ordinary sunlight for the first time in what their bodies insisted had been 4 days, and what a shattered wristwatch on Dorian's arm insisted, once it finally started ticking again, had been 96 hours to the minute. Mateo saw his aunt first, standing in the ragged opening where a wall used to be, dirt on her jeans, blood on her palm from where the bolt cutters had bitten into her skin, and he said her name in a voice that broke in the middle. And Elena crossed the last 20 feet at a dead run and got both arms around him before either of them said another word. Not everyone crossed that threshold. That is the part of the story that never made it into any of the news segments that followed, the part that Mrs. Acaffer carried privately for the rest of her life and spoke about only once, years later, to a counselor who asked her gently to describe the worst moment of those 4 days. One student, a quiet boy named Felix, who had sat in the back row and rarely spoken even before any of this started, had wandered too close to the tearing edge of the fog in the last frantic seconds, chasing after a phone he'd dropped, and the room closed around everyone else a half-second before it closed around him. Whether that half-second meant something terrible, or whether it meant, as Cavi desperately insisted for months afterward, that the fold had simply taken him somewhere else instead of nowhere at all, a difference he refused to stop believing in, nobody could ever say for certain. The federal report listed him as unrecovered. His mother kept his bedroom exactly as he'd left it for the rest of her life, in case that half-second turned out someday to matter. Agent Bratton did not stop the concrete trucks from arriving that morning. He simply told them, once the wall reopened and 26 living, breathing teenagers stumbled out into the cold gray dawn, that their services were no longer required, and then he stood very still for a long time, watching families run across frozen grass toward children the government had already, on paper, declared dead. He resigned 4 months later. Nobody ever printed the letter he wrote when he did, but Whitfield, who received a copy, told Alina once, over coffee, that it contained exactly one sentence he thought mattered. "I would rather be wrong about following orders than right about breaking a promise to tell the truth." Mrs. Okafor went back to teaching that spring, in a different classroom on the other side of the building, because the district quietly decided that room 214 would never again hold a class of students, and repainted the door with a number that didn't exist on any floor plan, and left it that way. She kept a photograph of that year's science class on her desk for the rest of her career. Not a formal school portrait, but a picture Priya's mother had taken on the day they all finally came home. 26 exhausted, filthy, radiant teenagers piled together on the school steps, arms slung over each other's shoulders in configurations that would have seemed unthinkable 4 days earlier. Jock and outcast and quiet kid and loud kid, all of them holding on. She told students for years afterward, when they complained about group projects, that she had once seen 26 14-year-olds build something impossible together out of a cracked wooden box and a rock nobody understood, and that she had never once seen anything since that made her doubt what kids were capable of when they stopped competing with each other and started surviving together. The town of Cedar Hollow never fully agreed on what to call what happened. Some people, for years, still said gas main, because it was easier to live near a school that had suffered an ordinary tragedy than one that had briefly stopped obeying the rules of the universe. Others said the vanishing, without ever specifying to what, or from what, as though naming it too precisely might invite it to happen again. Only a small circle of people ever heard the word fold, and fewer still ever learned the name Basu had eventually given it in a paper she was not permitted to publish under her own institution's name. A localized resonant displacement event. 4 careful words trying to hold the shape of something that had briefly swallowed a room full of children, and mercifully, given almost all of them back. Cavi never built another version of that device. He kept the cracked wooden crate on a shelf in his room for years, empty, the mineral sample confiscated by a federal team that showed up 11 days later with paperwork nobody could argue against. And some nights he still dreamed about a sound climbing higher than his own teeth could bear. And some nights he dreamed about frosted glass angles on the other side of gray fog that he was almost certain, in the dream, meant Felix was somewhere, and not nowhere. Alina stayed in Cedar Hollow for 6 more months, long after the news vans left, and the story faded into the strange, half-remembered category reserved for things too impossible to keep believing in once the danger had passed. She helped Matteo relearn how to sleep with the lights off. She helped Camilla stop hecking his bedroom 4 times a night. And on the 33rd night after the room came back, unable to sleep herself, she drove out past the school just to look at it. An ordinary building again, ordinary hallway, ordinary wall, freshly painted to match the one beside it so perfectly that a stranger walking past would never guess that anything had ever been wrong with it at all. She sat in her car for a long time, looking at that wall, and thought about how the whole world had been so ready to call 27 people dead the moment the evidence became inconvenient to explain, and how the only thing that had stood between that verdict and the truth was one person who refused to stop asking questions after everyone else had stopped. She thought, too, about Felix's bedroom, still made up the way he'd left it, 400 miles from here, and about a half-second that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything, and about how some doors, once they close, never tell you for certain which one it was. Then she started the car and drove back toward the motel, because somewhere in a house 6 minutes away, a 14-year-old boy was finally sleeping through the night, and that, at least, was a door that had opened all the way.